Okay, I'm going to have you do the slide for me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hold on, it's doing something weird. Do you see something weird on the?
It's recording.
That's fine.
Okay, cool. All right, there you go.
Awesome. So today we have Bethany Bradley, who is going to talk to us, is our technical speaker, is going to talk about the implications of climate change for invasive species. And she's calling all the way from Massachusetts, and thank you for joining us. And we just have a quick announcement that is actually at the beginning of her talk, and then we're just going to do some quick wrap up at the end. Next slide, please. In case you didn't know, Sherry, who's also on this call, and I are the co-chairs for the FISP. Oh my gosh, FISP. And if you have any questions, please contact us. We recently just hired the FISP coordinator, so her information will be available soon, and it will be definitely available for next month's April's CISMA call. I just wanted to do a quick shout out to all the events that went through the NISA, which is National Invasive Species Awareness Week. We have a lot of events going on throughout the state of Florida, which was very successful. And we have about 20 events, and I just want to, in the next few slides, just showcasing of all the events that we had during that week. And also we have an announcement that next week is going to be CISMA workshop during the FISP conference, which is Thursday evening from 9 till 12. Sherry, can you speak a few minutes about the agenda?
Sure. We're actually, the Florida Natural Areas Inventory will be presenting on EDRR species throughout the state, and a little bit we'll be talking about the definition that we came up with for EDRR a couple of years ago. And then we are going to go into a couple of presentations by a few CISMAs who have actually responded to EDRR species that were found in their areas. And then we hope that we're going to be developing some type of document for EDRR species, you know, how to do outreach for them within your CISMA, how to respond or how to get a group together to respond to them, and how to survey for them. And then we might get a chance, hopefully some of the CISMAs will bring some EDRR species or unknown species, so we might do a little bit of plant ID as well. So again, that's April 4th from 9 a.m. to noon, and it'll be at the Crown Plaza Oceanfront in Melbourne. And I encourage everyone to join us.
Thank you, Sherry.
You're welcome.
Next slide, please. Oh, and here are the events that showcase all the NISA events that happen throughout the state of Florida. I believe it's the next 4 slides if you want to just kind of click through right quick. So First Coast did a lot of events, and a lot of CISMA joined in, a lot of removing surveys, a lot of air potato surveys, a lot of EDR surveys. And thank you. I just want to give a quick shout out to all the successful events. All right. Now we're introducing Dr. Bethany Bradley. She is going to be our technical speaker for this month. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, my pleasure. And
This, for those of you guys who are going to make it to the FLEPC conference next week, you're going to see something very similar again. So you've got kind of a sneak peek at the beginning of that, and you're going to be experts by this time next week. So part of what I want to talk about today is basically this sort of intersection between two major forms of global change. So how climate change is likely to affect invasive species moving forward, and then some sort of different things that we might want to be thinking about in terms of the management of invasive species in light of climate change. Let's see if I'm just like waiting for the computer to catch up with my mouse. There it goes. Okay. So before we get started talking more about invasive species and climate change, the first piece is just to make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of why we're even bothering to deal with invasive species. I know you guys are already there with this message, but basically why we care is because of the negative impacts that invasive species have on native ecosystems and on economies. And this is a graph from meta-analysis, and I'm going to show quite a few meta-analyses throughout this talk. So a meta-analysis is basically a reanalysis of lots of different independent studies that are focused on a particular thing. So in this case, the impact of aquatic species on, for example, the abundance of fish, in that sort of top graph here. And what a meta-analysis, the reason a meta-analysis is so powerful is because it's not just sort of a single case study, but it's trying to represent kind of the general statement of what's going on when you have an invasive species or when different things are interacting. So for example, the way that we would read this is that if you have an invasive aquatic species in a system, and you're looking at the response of native fish on that sort of top line here, there were 28 studies that they were able to analyze that looked at the impacts of invasive aquatic species on fish. And for those, the effect size, so the effect of that impact was negative. So there was a negative impact of aquatic invasives on the abundance of fish. And since the error bars don't cross the 0 in that case, we can say that that's a significant negative impact. So invasive aquatic species have significant negative impacts. I mean, you've got negative across the board as far as what our mean estimate is, but significant in terms of impacts on fish, impacts on zooplankton, impacts on macrophytes. This is just an example of something another similar meta-analysis of the impacts on terrestrial invasive plants on native ecosystem properties. So significant negative effect size in this top graph of invasive plants on native plant growth, native plant abundance, diversity, and fitness. A suggestion certainly of a negative effect on a variety of different animal properties too, but significant negative impact on animal abundance and significant negative impact on animal fitness. And these kind of numbers over here are representative of the number of different studies that had a negative versus a positive impact. So if you look at the top one, 22 of the studies that they looked at showed a negative impact on native plant growth, and 10 showed either neutral or positive impact on native plant growth. So these meta-analyses are really powerful because they give us this more kind of general scope of, if we look at all of the scientific literature, what are the trends of, in this case, invasive plant impacts. So what I want to talk about today, and before I get too far, I should say that my bias is that I study primarily the biogeography of invasive plants. So and I come from Massachusetts, so you're going to see a little bit more focus on plants and on spatial patterns, and you're going to see a little bit more of a focus on stuff that's going on in more temperate systems, but hopefully all of those same conclusions, you're going to find that they're relevant for what's going on in Florida too. So I want to talk about rising temperatures associated with climate change, what that means directly, and then also indirectly in terms of changing phenology. I want to talk about rain shifts with climate change. I'm going to talk about climate variability and what that means for disturbance regimes. And then I'm going to talk specifically about plant responses to rising CO2, and then finish up with just some of our complications to these various different stories. So to start off with rising temperatures and earlier phenologies. So the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, thousands of scientists that have worked together to understand what anthropogenic emissions are doing to the global climate, have said that warming temperatures and longer growing seasons are virtually certain under changing climate, virtually certain that those are happening today and will continue to happen over the next century that the time horizon that they've been working with. So what does that mean for invasive versus non-invasive species? So this is another meta-analysis. So again, a reanalysis of lots of different individual studies that looked at the relative performance of, in this case, both aquatic and terrestrial plants and animals. And so in this case, the effect size, a positive effect size means that the invader is favored, and a negative effect size means that the native species are favored. And the one that they find significant here is that as you increase temperature, aquatic invasive species are performing significantly better than native aquatic species, and those are primarily animals that those studies are looking at. So again, the mechanism isn't necessarily the same or known in all of these cases, but if you look across the board, you tend to see that invasive species are favored when you increase the temperatures in aquatic systems. And we find something similar in terrestrial plant systems, that kind of mechanisms may vary by different species, but across the board, you're seeing invasive terrestrial plants performing slightly better than native terrestrial plants under these elevated temperatures. And so both of those, even if we're not sure exactly what the mechanism is in each case, we can draw these kind of general conclusions that warming temperatures might facilitate invasive species, make them have a better relative fitness from invasive versus native species in both terrestrial and aquatic systems. And there's another piece to the rising temperature. So not only do you have the sort of direct difference or increasing difference in fitness, but you also have this piece of the change in phenology. So how might rising temperatures favor invasion? So one hypothesis to this is that because invasive species tend to grow pretty fast, respond quickly to these disturbances, to novel resources being available, that they might be kind of the first out of the box in terms of responding to warming climate. So these are some pictures from kind of near me in Massachusetts to illustrate this point that spring has been coming earlier. So this is a picture of the same cemetery in a town in Massachusetts on the 30th of May in the late 1800s, and you can see that there's much more leaf on the 30th of May in 2005. Now we know that there's tons of variability kind of year to year, but overall we're seeing in many temperate systems this consistent advancing of spring of several days to weeks over the last decades kind of thing, decades to a century. And so, oops, too fast. So what that means for invasive species potentially is that if phenology is advancing and you as a species are able to respond quickly to that advancing in temperature, be the first if you're a plant, the first to green up, then you have what's called in invasion ecology a priority effect. And priority effect means that if you are the first out of the gate, the first to take in whatever those resources are, grow big before your native competitors even germinate or whatever stage they're doing, then you're going to have a big competitive advantage. And indeed, so this is an example from temperate systems, but there are a number of invasive plants in temperate systems where we have seen that they do indeed show this consistent pattern of earlier spring green up. That is, they're the first flush of green that we're seeing is from the invasive understory and not necessarily from the native canopy species. And another piece to that, so in addition to priority effects, if you're able to be the first out of the gate, another thing that's going to help you as a plant or animal species respond to climate change is plasticity. So basically where your growth is responding directly to temperature as opposed to responding to daylight. Right? So if you are responding directly to temperature, then you have that opportunity to be the first growing to get those priority effects. So the flexibility of responding to temperature might be an advantage under climate change. And there was this great study from now it's 10 years ago. This was done out of Boston University. So again, we're dealing with temperate plant systems, but this kind of neat resurvey of diversity of plants in Concord, Massachusetts. So they were able to find this survey that an amateur botanist, who's probably a better botanist than many of us today, collected in the late 1800s. So spent 14 years going around and surveying the relative abundance of these 429 flowering species in Concord. And in the early 2000s, they repeated that same survey of every flowering species that they could find in Concord. And this kind of graph over here, this circular graph with kind of the reds and blues in there, is a summary of the results. And so the reds on here are all species that had a major decline in abundance. And the kind of gray ones on here are ones that didn't change. And then there's a few blue on here, ones that increased in abundance. And basically they were trying to figure out, well, what was causing this change, these major changes, both declines as well as increases in abundance. And the best predictor of whether you were likely to decline or whether you were likely to increase was whether your flowering time responded to temperature or responded to daylight. So the ones that whose flowering times did not respond to temperature, that is, they were mostly focused on daylight, are all the ones in red on here that had these major declines. And the ones in here that are in blue were more like those more plastic responders to temperature changes. And there is a key invasive plant story in this too, which is that they also looked from amongst those ones that were increasing and said, well, you know, like, are invasives part of those increasing plants? And yes, indeed, not only are the invasives part of the increasing abundance population, but they also found that those tended to be the most plastic, so that the invasive plants had shifted their flowering time on an average of about 11 days earlier over the last century, whereas native plants and non-native, non-invasive plants had barely shifted it a single day. So the invasive plants much more responsive to the climate changes that we're already experiencing. So that kind of take-home point is that invasives, what we're finding is that invasives tend to be very responsive to warming temperature, and able to be first out of the gate to get those priority resources, and that tends to favor growth and increased abundance, and likely those changes that the meta-analyses at the beginning were showing, where you have this favoritism towards invasives with increasing temperature. So second piece that I want to talk about are climate change and range shifts. So one of the major things that we expect, that we've already observed for lots of different species, is shifts in distribution. So shifts in range as well as shifts in abundance of different species associated with climate change. And a key piece to know that affects the invasion part of this story is that climate change is happening really fast today, super fast compared to anything that we have over hundreds of thousands to millions of years in the paleoclimate record. So this graph that you're looking at is one from an ice core of Antarctica, where they took, oh gosh, it was like 2-kilometer long ice core, if you can imagine it. And then they're able to go in and actually sample all of the air bubbles that are in that 2-kilometer long ice core going back 650,000 years. And so in all of those little air bubbles in the ice cores, they can measure how much methane was there, how much CO2 was there, and then a little bit how much nitrous oxide, although there must be something about the stability of that gas that it's just not a whole lot of it, so it's harder to measure. And what you're seeing here is basically the glacial interglacial. So here's an interglacial, glaciation, whatever. Our last interglacial is right here. And then this kind of straight up, shooting up here on the right side is today's anthropogenic emissions of these 3 major greenhouse gases. So really, really fast, unprecedented in paleo history, like nothing that any of these species have ever experienced before. Oops. And so climate is changing really fast. Well, how fast are native species moving? Well, it turns out they're not moving all that fast. And this is just one example also from a temperate system in the Green Mountains in Vermont. And what they were looking at was the location of northern hardwoods, and then that sort of border between northern hardwoods and boreal forests at higher elevations. And there was a study done in 1964 that surveyed where the trees were at, and then they redid that study in 2004. And they found, consistent with what other observations have found with climate change, that these lower elevation species or more southern species are expanding northward and upward in elevation, and that your higher elevation species are contracting. But an estimate of how fast that was happening, well, they estimated that those trees, again, they're trees, so they're probably not going to move that fast, but we're changing by about 600 feet over 40 years. So not very fast in comparison to how fast these species would need to move to keep up to climate change. In contrast to that, invasive species are moving super fast across landscapes. And the reason for that is because we are doing a great job of dispersing invasive species across landscapes. So this is an example just from plants. We know that one of the main introduction pathway for invasive plants is through ornamental introduction, so through the green industry. And we look at where these ornamental plants are being planted, we see that those plants are being introduced into gardens that are well outside of the climate conditions of their native range. So this is an example just for, this is not an invasive species, but a non-native or an ornamental plant whose native range is a sort of red part in southern Europe around the Mediterranean. And all of these little green dots on here, including way up north, are nurseries that are selling this plant to homeowners. So regardless of whether you're a non-invasive or an invasive species, these ones that are widely dispersed by us are going to have a huge advantage as climate changes, because they've already been dispersed into these new habitats, new climate conditions that will become newly suitable as temperatures rise. And I already made this point, but most of those invasive plants and animals are being deliberately introduced and spread around by us. And so because we are such great vectors of dispersal, we're giving these invasive species already a big step up in the context of climate change. Just because we're really good at dispersing them. So whether that's, a lot of times in biologists, we like to think about, oh, natural forms of dispersal. Well, how far can the bird fly and bring the seed of, this invasive plant? But really what we need to be thinking about is, where are we planting the next crop of invasive bamboo? Or, where is that boat going that's carrying all of those zebra mussels or aquatic weeds or something like that? And then just to make that a final point on that even though the deliberate dispersal really focuses on ornamental plants and animals, you know, like fish and stuff like that, that those imports bring with them a number of other pests and pathogens that are accidentally introduced, but that we also care about and are also trying, you know, would love to avoid dispersing widely. So this is from a study from a few years ago that looked at how insect pests are arriving. So this graph on the left is showing that for all these green bars on here, basically the majority of our sap feeders, foliage feeders, and almost half of our pathogens are arriving on live plants. So arriving and being dispersed the same way that, that any of those ornamentals would be dispersed. And then you guys in Florida know this way better than we do in Massachusetts, but the more warm you are, the more pests you have to deal with. So, you know, where I am up in Massachusetts, we might have pests or a couple of life cycles of a pest, you know, maybe one in a single year. As it gets warmer and warmer, you have both a higher diversity of pests that can tolerate those warmer climate temperatures, as well as more and more life cycles of those species in a given year. So this might be not as much of a point for Florida because you're already dealing with this, but definitely a concern for your neighbors to the north, seeing more and more of the same types of pests that you guys are already dealing with. And that longer life cycle certainly also is influential across a variety of systems. This is just one example of the mountain pine beetle. So this is actually a native pest, but a lot of projections from climate change. So these sort of projections on the right side in this top right graph, that's an expectation of how many life cycles this pest might have under 1960 to 1990 climate. But by the end of the next century, you can see that there's a lot more of the kind of like red and orange colors on here. So higher risk of overwintering and therefore having more life cycles of the mountain pine beetle. And then this is another example of just an invasive plant. So just like we anticipate native species to shift their range, we also anticipate invasive species shifting their ranges. For me, coming from the Northeast, right, all of these areas up here that are kind of in the hash marks of potentially expanded risk, as well as high likelihood, which are kind of the red areas on here, are a big concern. But down in Florida, actually, we're seeing a potential of expanded risk for kudzu down there. One of its main limitations is winter temperature, it seems. So certainly, maybe it's just a dispersal limitation down in Florida. And then again, you know, like where in the world or where in the US are we likely to see changes in number of plants? So the Northeast and the northern states are these hotspots for future plant invasion, where we're anticipating a larger number of different species. The Southeast, actually, interestingly, and as well as extending into Florida, are areas where, on the whole, actually, you would expect fewer invasive species to persist in that location. However, this study is only focused on the current pool of invasive species. So based on just what we're dealing with today, some of those species might actually be less tolerant of the hotter temperatures in Florida and might become less problematic. But we also need to think about all of the new species that are likely to come in and be introduced as well. So so there's a little bit of kind of good news, silver lining there within the current pool, but there's still persistent risk from the ones that are coming in. And actually, one of the things that we've been doing is trying to match together these range shift models with an impacts prioritization. And Florida is actually in this kind of unique position where you guys are, certainly for all of us further north, you guys are a donor, or sort of like, you know, you are the first front of dealing with these invasive species that, if they become invasive in Florida, may well, you know, in 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, become increasingly problematic in states that are slightly cooler and further north of you guys. So the more information that you know and are able to share across borders and with collaborators outside of Florida, that I know that's not great news for Florida itself, but it could be a huge boon for a lot of your neighboring states. So one of the pieces that we're trying to work on right now is to match together these range shift models with prioritization. So trying to understand what the potential impacts of these species are based on impacts assessments that have already, or experiments and whatnot that have already been done. This is essentially a literature review. And these are just a couple of examples of species that, and our work is focused on the Northeast, so species that have not yet arrived in the Northeast, but could potentially shift their ranges into the Northeast with climate change and potentially have large impacts on different sectors. And so the take-home point on this is that all species ranges are likely to be shifting, but it's the invasive species that we're cultivating that have this huge advantage. So I guess a kind of corollary to that is the degree to which we can really encourage people to plant native species, even native species outside of their native range. That is going to be a huge boon for our native communities, because it allows them to at least keep up to the same degree that we're already giving that advantage to invasives. So next piece that I wanted to talk about is this disturbance piece. So you guys probably have lots of examples where you've seen that disturbance happens and you get lots of invasive species in that particular area. It's something that we see consistently amongst the invasion ecology literature, that invasive species tend to be very disturbance responsive. And so how does that link to climate? So climate variability is a form of disturbance, right? You have a hurricane that's definitely, going to create some sort of disturbance. You have major, whether it's a heavy rainfall event, a drought, a heat wave, all of those are forms of disturbance on an ecosystem. And so this is just a graph of rainfall, our history of rainfall over the last century. And if you look at the lower left, that's the average overall, certainly the Southeast. You see this increasing trend in this, what's called on here, the extreme index. So this was looking at extreme rainfall events. I can't remember exactly how it was defined, but it was sort of like 2 days of rainfall that you would expect to happen only once in, a decade or something like that. And the number of those has been increasing dramatically over the last century, and especially since the, 70s and 80s kind of time period. And so that is true both of precipitation. It's also true of droughts. This kind of weird thing that happens with the hydrologic cycle: as you warm temperature, you get extremes on both ends. So you get more heavy rainfall, but you also get more extreme drought. And so just an example of invasive, these are both invasive plant species examples, but that invasive species tend to thrive under increased disturbance. So for this one on the left, this is garlic mustard. As you increase disturbance, in this case, taking down canopy and increasing light availability, and you have propagules of that species, you get this huge increase in density of the plant. And you can find lots of pictures of kudzu at disturbed forest edges on the internet. The other piece of this, so a lot of times we kind of focus specifically on the invasive species component. So what are the invasive species going to do? What kind of advantages are they going to have? But the other piece that we really need to focus on is what happens to the native communities, native species and communities with climate change. And because our native communities are less mobile, because we haven't dispersed them as widely as we have the invasives and our non-natives, it means that they have to kind of survive in place kind of thing. And unfortunately, a lot of them are not doing that very successfully. So this is just an example for temperate forest systems, that native tree mortality increases substantially as you add these climate change components: heat stress, drought stress. So increasing disturbance not only part of the reason why increasing disturbance facilitates invasion is because it knocks back the native population. And this is just another example associated with hurricanes. So this is a tree canopy cover and understory plants following Hurricane Katrina. And so a survey from, I think the survey was done in Louisiana. And you can see tree canopy cover prior to Katrina in this upper right graph, maintaining itself around 80%. The hurricane comes along and you have this huge drop in tree canopy cover. And what happened then is that you increase the light availability and the resources for understory plants. And so you see a corresponding jump in the density of understory plants. And so in this particular case, it turned out that most of those understory plants were actually invasive understory plants. Now it remains to be seen what the long-term, I haven't seen a follow-up from this study yet, but what the long-term trajectory is. Would those invasive understory plants actually impede forest regeneration in some way, or do you just kind of eventually have normal forest succession going on and the shading out of many of these understory species? But it definitely, with increasing disturbance events, including increasing frequency of hurricanes, which has been observed associated with climate warming, then potentially we have this change in the structure and composition of our forested systems. And so a take-home point on that is that all of these forms of climate variability, increasing precipitation peakiness, as well as increasing drought, as well as increasing the frequency of hurricanes, all of those create novel disturbances. And those do two things. They knock back native ecosystems, and they also provide an opportunity for these kind of fast-growing invasive species to take over. Last piece that I want to talk about is the plant response to rising CO2. So this is a graph from Mauna Loa, the largest volcano in Hawaii. So this, they started measuring this. This is a graph that's called the Keeling curve, after Charles Keeling, who started this experiment back in the 50s. And the reason I chose the top of Mauna Loa is because it's basically as far away as you can get, middle of the Pacific Ocean, really far from any kind of direct cities or sort of human direct introduction of CO2, that this is going to measure the kind of average conditions around the globe of CO2. The little seesaw pattern in here is just a remnant of most of the northern hemisphere being terrestrial, and most of the southern hemisphere being marine, oceans. And so this is just sort of the northern hemisphere, all of those boreal forests and stuff like that, breathing in, sucking in all that CO2 as the plants, and then senescence in the fall kind of thing is what you're seeing on there. But the main thing to pay attention to is just this huge, really obvious increasing trend in CO2 in the atmosphere. We are now in 2018 well above this 400 mark. We've got our sights set on 410 within the next year or two. And so what does that do for plants, right? So CO2 is a really important resource for plants. Going back to 5th grade biology, right? Plants need CO2, water, and light to grow and then give off oxygen. And so this is actually a picture at the bottom from one of the ExxonMobil sites, right? That tells you, don't worry about rising CO2 because plants love it. This is some sort of pine species that they were showing. Great, you can grow a bigger pine if you've got higher CO2. And it is true that CO2 acts as a resource for different plants, and we do see plants growing larger. We see increased growth in our trees and crops, increased flowering, increased fruiting, greater seed mass. But the problem with all of that is that every plant is not equal. So all of these species are not necessarily growing and having the same level of advantage. And there might be some trade-offs. So for example, with this pine species, which is, you know, a plantation pine, one of the problems when you increase the amount of CO2 is that the wood material itself becomes less dense, right? And so some of the applications of that pine are not as great as they were at lower CO2 levels. So what matters is the relative advantage of some species relative to others. So this is going back to another one of these meta-analyses. So looking at close to 100 studies, in this case, in these papers, of comparisons between terrestrial invasive and terrestrial native plants. The invasive plants perform much better under rising CO2. So they have a much more positive, you can see that the native plants are also responding positively, that is they're to the right of the 0 line, but the invasives are performing even better. So you have this relative difference that really, really matters. And so what else does that matter for? Well, it's going to affect how effectively you can control these invasive plants. This was a study from 2004 that looked at herbicide, sorry, it should say herbicide on there, not pesticide, but herbicide resistance of Canada thistle under current versus elevated CO2. And so the one on the left is where they sprayed with sort of the recommended level of herbicide, and that worked pretty well under current climate conditions. But when you got to future climate conditions, spraying with that same recommended level of herbicide had very, very poor effect of controlling the Canada thistle. And they dug into the mechanism behind that a little bit and found that the reason was because with higher CO2, plants are able to more easily invest a lot more biomass below. They had a lot more root biomass, and therefore even killing off their above ground biomass, they were able to recover relatively easily. So those were all plant examples. There are examples for other invasive species too. So this is that another one of those meta-analyses looking at differences. So terrestrial and aquatic invasive plants, just like the one just before this, have an advantage under rising CO2. When you go to aquatic systems, you actually see the reverse, where both invasive, so in invasive in this case are all of the gray triangles and the natives are all of the black circles. In aquatic systems, adding CO2 to the system, and certainly in marine, you know, these systems where you're adding acidity to those systems, decreases the performance of both native and non-native, but it further decreases native. So in terms of a relative advantage, you still end up with that same advantage towards the invasive species. And this is just an example of one that we think a lot about in temperate systems up in the north, but native winter with rising CO2 is poison ivy. So this was actually a case study where they were doing a CO2 exchange experiment in, I think it was in North Carolina. So adding CO2 to the forest to see what happens to the forest, see how those trees are responding. Instead, they found that they were getting really itchy and they were trying to figure out why and thought, gosh, is it just me or is there a lot of poison ivy around here? And then of course, being like what any, you know, like bigwig scientist is going to do, they found a graduate student and sent her out to do all of these collections of poison ivy. And she found that not only does poison ivy grow faster, under higher CO2, but it also becomes, to add insult to injury, becomes more allergenic. And so the take-home point relative to CO2 is that all plants are expected to do better under higher CO2, but it's the relative improvement or the relative difference between those two that matters. And we are seeing consistently across the board that invasives do better than natives do when you add that additional CO2 resource. Cool. So I just want to wrap up with a couple of these known unknowns. So things that add complication to this whole story. And this graph is from a 2009 paper that's also focused on temperate systems, but just making the point that there are a lot of arrows here. So invasive species are not just interacting with native species and climate, but they're also interacting with other pests and predators, competitors, and other places. They're interacting with whatever's going on below ground and interacting with other, structural and disturbance regimes and stuff like that. And so that means that just as we have a hard time predicting today what's going to happen with invasive species, adding climate to the mix doesn't make that any easier. So that we can come up with some of these generalities from these different meta-analyses and from seeing what different studies have been done, but we can't necessarily say that in this particular case or this particular location, this is exactly what's going to happen. We just have to infer a lot from the broader literature. And just another example for aquatic systems that you have a lot of arrows and lines connecting these things, so interactions are challenging to predict. And this one is really, I think, super relevant to what's going on in Florida and what we should be thinking about today, which is that we are constantly importing new species that might eventually become invasive. So lots of new ornamental plants. With those, we're bringing novel insect pests and pathogens. And as we introduce more things, so as trade increases over here on this graph on the right, you also see more introductions of things, right? Of course, which makes sense. The more you trade with different people, the more new things you're going to get. The real risk, though, or the biggest risk for dealing with invasive species are these ones that are real early on the scene as far as trade goes. So we've just started trading with them within the last, this is a new plant to the scene or a new, animal or something that we're importing for the first time. We don't know anything about it. Those are the ones that have kind of the highest risk as far as establishing and becoming invasive. And one of the things that the reason that potentially intersects with climate change a little bit is that where most of these totally novel species are coming from, so this is from a paper that was looking specifically at nursery imports, most of those novel species are coming from countries that are warmer than the US on average. So they're coming from, warm places in Africa, Southeast Asia, South America. There's a couple of cold ones in here too, but on average, many of these countries where we're getting these new plants and new animals from are a little bit warmer. And why that's relevant is because if we're warming the climate within the US, then those are exactly the species that we would be most concerned about, slightly warmer adapted, getting into the US and becoming established and ultimately invasive. So you guys in Florida, as far as being this sort of hub of these imports of the latest and greatest of ornamental plants and pets and everything else, really have a finger on the pulse in many ways of what the future of invasive species in the US are going to look like. And so just to finish up, the big emphasis that I would say as far as outreach to, like citizens and anybody else that you're interacting with is to focus on planting local. Certainly for plant species and ornamentals, there's a nice website called Plant Native that helps to identify nurseries in your area that focus on native plants. These are a couple. This is an example from New England. The degree to which we can focus on planting either local or regionally local, so if you're in the northern part of Florida, stuff that's coming from the southern part of Florida, the better off we're going to be in the long run as far as reducing risk of these range shifting species with climate change. So this is just a summary of all of the those different pieces that we expect invasives to respond more positively than natives will to warming temperature, as well as green up or start their growing season earlier. We expect species ranges to be shifting, but we also anticipate that invasive species that were already moving around are going to have a big head start in terms of getting to those climates that are becoming better and better for them. We know that climate variability creates a novel form of disturbance, and we know that disturbance favors invasives. And then lastly, we know that invasive species have this big growth advantage as CO2 is rising. So I think I'll leave it there. I've got a couple of slides of citations too after this, if any of you guys are interested.
So did anybody have any questions? You want to type them in the group chat or speak up? Well, I can throw a question out there. In terms of the phenology, sort of that early leaf out, especially up in the temperate forests up in the Northeast and Midwest. You talked about the early leaf out. What do you think are the implications, of how the shift in phenology will match up with the herbivores, the generous herbivores, when they come out? Are the herbivores adjusting to the climate shifts? And then my second question would be, how does that go into the fall? So with like honeysuckle and privet, they're almost evergreen.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, the herbivores is a really interesting question. I mean, if you're talking about native herbivores, then we don't know for sure. Actually, this is a big question of phenological mismatch is a big concern of climate change research generally, you know. So if you are, you know, a bird migrating and flying north, are you responding to similar cues as your prey when you arrive, kind of thing, if they're responding to different things? So yeah, I don't know that we know what the timing of herbivores is likely to be like until we start seeing the response actually happening. As far as the fall piece goes, yeah, now I'm trying to think of what I know about this, which is not a whole lot. I think that there are sort of different strategies that you can have as a plant. And the fall strategy of like staying green longer in the fall, you know, is less costly to the plant than trying to green up early in the spring, kind of thing, you know. So if you green up early in the spring and you get eaten or you get a frost or something like that, it's more resource intensive to like grow a whole new plant than it is to try to stay green longer in the fall. And so it may well be that many of the invasives that are able to nearly last year round are actually, you know, have a pretty big fitness advantage in the fall season as well as in the spring season. But most of the work that I have seen has focused on the spring.
Cool. There's a question that was typed in from Chris. Is there more pressure to discontinue research on climate-related plant responses and looking at natives versus invasives, or just in general, regarding the prevalence of this climate denying and the current administration? I'm guessing the current administration's funding priorities.
Yeah, so actually, I mean, so generally, as far as science research goes, it's been surprisingly good. The budget that was just passed last week is surprisingly good for science. You know, like we were anticipating, you know, like they were talking about like cutting the EPA nearly entirely, and I think the EPA funding remained flat or something like that, and most of the other science budgets, you know, actually increased by some, you know, a few percent kind of thing, which is way better than huge cuts that everybody was anticipating. So yeah, as to the climate question, you know, I mean, it sucks because it just seems so stupid, but like what a lot of people are doing is trying to like recouch what is actually climate change research, you know, in terms of climate variability or something else. I mean, all of those things certainly are part of the same question that we're trying to answer. So if there is indeed, as many people worry, you know, some bureaucrat now in Washington who's like looking for the key terms of climate change and like rubber stamping a big X on those proposals or something, then I think a lot of people are worried about that and are trying to avoid that as a possibility. But yeah, I mean, generally the funding agencies like the National Science Foundation will fund the best science that is out there, and climate change is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, you know, scientific concern of our generation. So they are definitely still focused on those, and they are driven by scientists who are looking for the best science. I know, you know, like in contrast, the USDA doesn't fund much of anything that deals with climate change, because they have sort of a different structure to the way that their funding is allocated. So I guess sort of time will tell.
Yeah, while you were giving your talk, I had a push notification, a leaked memo from the EPA with talking points on how to downplay climate change within the EPA. So it's pretty timely. We have another question from Roxanne with regard to climate change. Are there any management actions land managers can take to strengthen or improve resiliency in the natural areas they work in?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of like climate change adds the types of things that you've already been doing, but more so. You know, that we don't know which species are likely to. We don't have range shift maps for every species, so we don't know how every single species is likely to respond to climate change. And so the degree to which you can keep working on improving diversity within areas kind of gives that ecosystem the tools to pick and choose the ones that are going to be the winners and losers within it. And I guess the other piece I would say is that part of what's going to be normal is already normal with climate change is that things are changing, you know, ecosystems are shifting. And so I think that's a big challenge for us, is to say, well, in what cases is losing a given species or, you know, what have you, a big concern versus just part of the process that what this particular ecosystem is going to look like in the future, because that species just can't handle the change in climate.
And maybe we can make this, we have a few minutes left, just a few minutes left, but the last question from Chris: what are your greatest concerns moving forward, and what are you optimistic about regarding the change in response in native or non-native species, change in response?
I'll start with the optimistic one. So actually, the fact that we have now models and for many different invasive species. So, I mean, invasive species, of course, are a major concern. And so a lot of scientists and biogeographers especially have been working on understanding where are they likely to move to. And we have that for all of the invasive plants within the US. So we've got like 900 species of plants, and we have these range shift models for all of them. And what that actually allows us to do, where previously, you know, if you're trying to do early detection and rapid response in an area, you have, you know, like a bazillion different plants that you could choose to work on, but you don't know how many of those non-natives are just, you know, non-natives hanging out, as they will do forever, and how many of them are, you know, your next invasive that's going to become really problematic, right? So if you spend a ton of time trying to eradicate every single non-native, then you'll do that for the rest of your life, and you may or may not actually have gotten the ones that are going to become a problem. The kind of cool thing about climate change in that particular problem is that now we actually have lists of the species that are likely to become more invasive, or, you know, or newly arrive into an area that are invasive elsewhere. And so it might help, at least in that one small piece, to prioritize which of the species we really want to focus on for early detection and rapid response, and for monitoring. And I think one of the other things that we're thinking about is not only for monitoring in EDRR, but also thinking about like state level listing, because many of these species are ornamental plants. So if you've got an ornamental plant that became invasive, in Florida or Georgia, in Massachusetts, it's going to be a while before Massachusetts has a climate like Florida and Georgia. Hopefully not in our lifetimes, but like it's coming. And so maybe we should be really proactive about that and say like, hey, let's not have our, homeowners growing and proliferating that plant. It's not invasive here now, but it could be one of these days because we know it is further south. Yeah, greatest concerns. I don't know. Let's stop with the optimism part. That's better.
All right. Are you still on the call there, Sherry or Sam?
Yes, I'm back on the call. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Perfect. Excellent. If you guys have any additional questions, you can make sure to catch Dr. Bradley at the FISP meeting, and she'll be there on Wednesday afternoon. So trying to catch her for her talk, and definitely contact her for more information. So I just want to let you guys know that we still need verifiers for the ed maps. If you are interested in any of these counties, please contact Dexter from FNA and for more information. He gave you a lot more information than I could hear. But if you're interested and you're good at plant identification, I feel like I should stress this. You're good at plant identification, please contact him. Next, please. Also, for all the CISMA leads, please continue to use the Google form to update all your events and your success. How we're gonna document. It's gonna make going to our quarterly success stories. Next, please. Also, to remind CISMA leads that we do have calendars. Please update your calendars so that people can see what you're up to. And if you find this not useful, or if you want to chat more about that, please contact Sharon and I. And just a reminder that our next month we have our CISMA talk is going to be Six Rivers, and our technical talk is going to be Susan Wild. She's going to be talking about AVM with eagles and hydrillas. So come join us next month on April 25th.
Oh.
And thank you for everyone joining us. I know we ran over, I think, by a minute, but thank you for joining us. We'll see you next month.
Thanks, Sam.
Thanks, Sherry. Thanks.
Thanks, Dia.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Bethany, for being our speaker. It was very interesting. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think she logged off, but.
Okay. Yeah.
We'll see her next. I'll see her next week at FLEPSI, so we'll be.
Yeah, let her know, please. I got to the end of the presentation. I was like, hello.